光る風から続いてるハリーさせて君のもとへラブドライブへと
Welcome back to part 2 of the Negima episode of Read the Fucking Manga. Also known as the part in which we actually talk about the fucking manga. We'll talk about the story, the characters, and other good points the anime left out. So without further ado, let's get to it. As I said before, the first Negima anime only really covers about 16% of the source material, and when you consider how they butchered the Kyoto arc, it's really only 8%. That gets a somewhat faithful adaptation. So what overall is missing from the series? Where does the story go that makes it worth reading? Well, to start, the first major arc to follow the Kyoto arc is the school festival. I mean, there's some in-between stuff where there's a whole bunch of training, and Negi has Kufei train him in fighting, and he has Ava train him in magic, and there's a bunch of stuff, and there's this one guy, Wilhelm, who ends up being completely irrelevant, and it doesn't matter, so we're gonna skip that. But those chapters actually are pretty decent, and they're worth reading. It's just, they don't really affect the overall story. So, the school festival arc. The name describes it pretty accurately. Mahora has its annual school festival, and being a giant school full of magical teachers and seemingly too much money, the festival is so massive and extravagant that it makes an excellent excuse for supernatural events. Chief among them being the surge of magical energy in Mahora's ancient world tree, the level of which is at a peak of a 22-year cycle. Festival lighting makes a good excuse for a giant glowing magic tree. The magic in the tree sort of ties the whole arc together in that at the peak of the festival, it can grant wishes, but most of those wishes seem to take the form of people proposing or making love confessions, and that leads to some wacky hijinks as only Akamatsu can write them. But something else that this allows for is the first and only real tournament arc we get in Negima, with entrants including Negi, Kotaro, Asuna, Setsuna, the mysterious Colonel Sanders and his tasty chicken, and Takahata-sensei, among others. While initially the participants planned to explain away the fight's fantastical events as special effects, there seems to be a lot more going on behind the scenes, as it's revealed that this and many other elements of the festival are being controlled by one of Negi's students, Xiaoling Shen. This arc is further complicated by the science-y, magic-y time-traveling watch I mentioned earlier, which is given to Negi by Chao as a way for him to do everything on his massively overbooked schedule, like some sort of overzealous Hogwarts student. The festival arc is a lot of fun, especially because it begins to straddle the line of magic being a secret. A lot of the creativity in Negima is stifled early on by the need for magic to stay hidden and keep things firmly shackled in the high school rom-com setting. This arc starts to shed that while still maintaining the secrecy of magic as a key plot point and reaffirming the consequences of what might happen if everything were to come out in the open. After the festival arc comes the magical world arc, and I'll be completely honest here, this is far and away my favorite part of Negima. You know that part in a video game where you're like, man, I really want to replay that video game just for that one part, but then you remember that there's other parts in the game you gotta get through first? The magical world arc is that for me. It's that part that always makes me, I want to come back and just read that and just skip over all the other stuff. Not to say the other stuff isn't good in its own right, but this is really what Negima is to me. Really, the other arcs do their job to lay the groundwork, establish the characters, establish the world, establish growth trajectory, and just a general feel of the series, so that this arc can step in and capitalize on all that and really knock it out of the park. So this arc follows Negi and a large group of his students as they accompany him on what is expected to be a somewhat risky, but overall safe venture into Mundus Magicus, the magical world. Things go wrong, however, and shortly after arriving, the group is attacked by the same mysterious boy we saw in the Kyoto arc, Fate. Fate has risen to big boss status, and his first act as such is to scatter Negi and his allies across the magical world. What follows is a high fantasy epic adventure that spans roughly 180 chapters, just over half the length of Negima as a series. Enemies become friends, friends become badasses, and many people will fall in love. So I've stated pretty clearly at the fact that I'm not really a fan of the whole keeping magic a secret aspect of the series thus far. Honestly, I've never been a fan of this trope in any series that I can recall, and it can be frustrating because it shows up in so many anime. Scenarios like this tend to get repetitive really quickly, and I always find that things become so much more interesting and fun when the characters who have been ignorant to the secret get to actually be a part of things. It's great to see characters we like show an aptitude for things and excel based on parts of their character that we have already seen. This is something that I think Negima does particularly well. Asakura's obsessive paparazzi-like dedication to finding a story leads to her becoming a skilled reconnaissance expert. Chisame's analytical mind and stick-upper ass gives her a more level-headed perspective on things, and when combined with her knowledge of the almighty internet, her information network allows her to help Negi and company in a number of ways. Kufei's dedication to her Chinese martial arts allows her to become physically one of the strongest fighters in the series, while also serving as Negi's teacher in hand-to-hand combat. Some characters already have a knowledge of magic and improve more as a matter of personal growth and development. It is, however, unfortunate that not all of the characters get this kind of development, and others sometimes get handed development way too late in the series to ever become relevant. Although action and adventure gain an increased prominence later in Negima, it never forgets that it's a harem series. This goes through varying levels of creepiness, as Negi is only 10 years old. Early on, the girl's affection is much more in the vein of simple crushes or fawning over his cuteness. The only character that ever really bothered me is Ayaka, who flat out makes it her goal to marry Negi and very dangerously tiptoes into child abductor territory and is pretty much hey kid wanna SS the character. As the series goes on, however, things are mitigated by the fact that Negi grows mature as a person, both mentally and physically, thanks to him spending an excessive amount of time in Ava's hypertonic lion tamer.
That one was on purpose.
Could have been.
Plus, the love that the girls feel for him tends to be more fleshed out and in many cases platonic. The specific girls that do feel a romantic love for Negi feel as such for well-explained reasons, and in a few cases where it is specifically addressed, both parties make it clear that any kind of relationship would be impossible, both because of their relationship as a teacher and student, and also because of Negi's age. Making it explicit that any kind of relationship between Negi and any girl would have to wait until many years later. Despite the necessary deferral of any relationship for Negi, the romantic elements play an ever-present part as the race for who will be best girl is run. There are many great choices, and some terrible ones, but in the end, only one can win the Negi Bowl. Thanks to the sequel series being basically an excuse to tie up loose ends, Akamatsu did reveal the final choice via flashback in the UQ Holder manga, although who it is, you'll have to read to find out for yourself. Considering Negi is the anchor of this tangled web of fuzzy feelings, how others feel about him will tend to dictate their role within the story and the path that they will walk. While it may look early on like the series is going to end up being a harem comedy with 30 different girls, it actually sort of doesn't. Sure, there's a lot of doting and fawning over Negi by the majority of the class, but that doesn't necessarily translate into anything beyond lighthearted teasing. Whole swaths of the class have no romantic interest in Negi. They still serve as part of the cast and engage in shenanigans, but their lack of further interest in Negi leads to some of them not getting involved much in the story. A few of them flat out get left in the mundane world during the final Magical World arc, and end up kind of abandoned. Others serve more of an older sister or mentor type role. Mana is a great example of this because she not only has no romantic interest in Negi, and no interest in him at all really besides an amused curiosity, but she also has her own past, people she cares for, and secrets that we're not immediately privy to. This also goes for characters like Setsuna, Zazie, Chao, Kaede, and sort of Asakura, who all end up being a lot more interesting than the girls that get left behind, and whose self-sufficiency lets them play an important role and have standout moments of action that are frankly pretty fucking badass. One character who sort of occupies her own special niche is Haruna, who has no romantic feelings for Negi, but is not what anyone would call a role model. She's instead part of a trio of friends with Nodoka and Yue, and gives them both advice about their feelings for him, while becoming a colossal badass in and of herself. Speaking of Yue and Nodoka, I probably should address them. I don't plan to go into every single character in the series because that would take far too long. And as things are going, this video is long enough and then some. Suffice to say, the core group of Negi's romantic hopefuls include a boring cheerleader whose key trait is being dumb and genki, an ancient lolly vampire who's also in love with his dad and will eventually be in love with his grandson, a double-life leading tsundere otaku idol who's actually way more likable than she sounds, Son Goku, a robot with an orbital laser cannon, and a childhood friend who has less screen time than a talking weasel. I want to talk about Yue and Nodoka because they kind of demonstrate how Negima handles romance. And also they're two of my favorite characters. Everyone has their best girl when they get into a series. Some people decide who would be the best girl for the main character to end up with, some people claim waifus, and some people just want to hurt themselves. When I first read Negima, Nodoka was my best girl. And I mean that in the sense that I thought she was the best choice for Negi. She's the first girl to truly admit her romantic feelings for Negi, and while she begins the story as an incredibly shy girl who can barely say 2 words to him, the consistent efforts she makes, aided by her friends, to put herself out there really speak to the genuine nature of her feelings. Nodoka is pure, or at least pure with her feelings, and she never denies her love. Her confliction comes from doubts about her own worthiness, and these doubts push her to improve and become more the kind of person that she feels is worthy of being loved. Now, it can be argued that this is not necessarily a healthy mindset to approaching relationships, but it definitely errs more on the side of becoming the person she wants to be and not the kind of person that Negi wants her to be. After all, if Negi got his way, she would never be more than a mundane high school girl passing her tests and getting a good job, not a treasure-hunting, mind-reading badass who stands up to ludicrously strong enemies and puts herself in mortal danger to rescue others. Did I mention Nodoka becomes a badass? Because she becomes a fucking badass. Yue, on the other hand, is sort of the opposite. Yue begins not loving Negi, and she does her best along with Haruna to help support Nodoka in her efforts. It's not until she gets pulled into the supernatural happenings of the story that she slowly begins to carry a torch for Negi, not recognizing it until it's staring her full in the face. Even then, Yue's response is to deny it, something she does until she can't anymore. Her guilt in feeling she's betrayed her best friend by loving the same man is something she carries with her across the entire series. This next part is a bit of a spoiler, but I don't think it's a particularly vital one. Even so, you can skip to the time on the screen if you wish to avoid it. So during the Magical World arc, Yue loses her memory in the accident which separates the group. She ends up in a magic school and has her own mini Little Witch Academia before rejoining the major plot. This amnesia, while not particularly important to the plot overall, does a lot for her character. Because she starts as more of a reserved underachiever, it's a little hard to root for her to aspire to anything, as funny as her dry comments might be. But as she grows into a powerful magician in the magical world, and her raw talent becomes exposed, things begin to clarify. I think Yue losing her memory is easily the best thing for her character, because it gives her a fresh start. Yue's personality remains the same. Still, she is reserved, dry-witted, and fiercely loyal. She still has a curious nature about things she cares about, and exhibits a talent for thinking on her feet and developing calculated plans. Seeing all of this benefit her in her new life is so goddamn satisfying. It feels like she finally found what she's meant to do, and the lack of baggage from the old world shows that it's what she wants to do, and not from any other influence. Upon rereading the manga in preparation for this episode, I found my opinions wavering. My once unshakable belief that Nodoka should win the Negi Bowl cracked at its foundation. And by the end of this reread, I found myself instead rooting for Yue. I put this down to 2 reasons. First, I think Yue is a lot more likable when you know the full scope of her character arc. A lot of her interests and talents I think are consistent across the series, but they're kind of understated early on, so it's not until later that you really start to understand her as a character. But mainly, I think it came down to how they grew, and Negi's position within that growth. Yue loves Negi, but Negi is not why she changes. She is given a clean slate so that she can work to become a great mage, because that is what she wants to do. It lets her make friends that she can fight for because that's what she wants. When she reunites with Negi, her inevitable feelings for him feel more genuine because we know it comes from who he and she are as people. She will end up loving him no matter what experiences they have together because that's just what happens when the kind of person she is and the kind of person he is meets. The second reason why I ended up not thinking ending up with Negi would be the best thing for Nodoka is that Nodoka grows so much as a person across the series. She goes from helpless and timid to driven and self-sufficient. She does everything she can to help Negi and is one of the most important allies in his party. I think a satisfying ending for Nodoka would have been for her to become independent, growing out of her admiration and desire to become worthy, and instead establishing herself as his equal, and having a relationship of mutual respect and reliance. That's not to say a romantic relationship can't be one of mutual respect and reliance, but the way that Negi and Nodoka's relationship starts out and inevitably kind of develops, there's sort of a power gap or authority gap between the two of them, and it just doesn't really feel like something that would translate well into a healthy relationship. But then again, that's also just me, and what the fuck do I know about relationships, and I'm not a counselor, and I don't even know why I'm talking about this. Point is, Yue is best girl. It is really difficult to give a brief overview of the main characters Negima because there are just so god-damned many. Hell, the core cast reaches past 30 in just the first chapter. I could easily write more about Nodoka and Yue, and write much, if not more, about the others. But I feel like the 3 most important characters left to cover would be Negi, Kotaro, and Fate. Although I'm sure I'll touch on more as I go. First and simplest is Kotaro. Sweet, dumb Kotaro. Beginning as a minor villain, Kotaro grows to be Negi's best friend and a very grounding force for him. Kotaro is much more a bratty kid who just happens to be super powerful. Where Negi is hesitant, Kotaro is impulsive. Where Negi is polite and reserved, Kotaro is honest and often rude, albeit unintentionally. Kotaro makes a home for himself with a few of Negi's students who take him in when he appears on campus in pretty bad shape. Much of Kotaro's growth centers around acting more mature and caring about things other than fighting, and people other than himself. Where Kotaro really shines is in his ability to bring Negi back to the level of being a kid. Negi constantly conducts himself in a prim and proper way. Most of his day-to-day interactions are between him and his students, and in these situations he has to remain an authority figure, or at least try to act as a role model. But Kotaro is just another kid, and when Negi is around him, he can be a kid again, and have fun. It's pretty uncommon to have the young male protagonist of a shonen series be the downbeat, calculating one, while the sidekick is the more straightforward, everything will be fine kind of personality. I think this is a core aspect of what makes Kotaro one of my favorite characters in the series. Also, he's a badass. Kotaro's powers actually end up being really cool. He's kind of a half yokai wolf god kind of thing. It's never really properly explained, but his powers start off as being able to like summon wolf ghosts, but later he turns into a giant fucking wolf with a sword in his mouth like Okami. It's fucking awesome. I love Kotaro. The next of our trio of Shotas is Fate Avarunkus, a minor villain of the Kyoto arc who becomes the main threat for the second half of the series. Fate's motivation after his reintroduction in the Magical World arc are constantly shifting mysteries. And like most good villains, the more we find out about his reasoning, the more difficult it becomes to find fault with his motives. I don't want to give this element away, so instead I'd rather focus on Fate's personality, which seems almost non-existent at first glance. Fate definitely occupies the emotionless, dull character archetype. But Fate's character does run deeper than that, despite what might appear on the surface. Fate is incredibly powerful. In addition to being nearly untouchable, he also possesses incredibly powerful earth magic. Something to note is that the magic users in Negima all seem to kind of fall into one specific element. So Negi uses air, and he has lightning abilities. Ava is water or ice specifically, and Fate is earth. This means that Fate can throw giant stone pillars on people, or hit them with a swell of magma. He can even use mass petrification magic, which is really just hacks at that point. But despite his calm, aloof demeanor, Fate can actually be quite childish and petty. Fate is actually much more than a detached, emotionless, murdering doll, as he appears to be. A good example of this is a scene near the middle of the magical world arc. Negi and friends have just arrived in the royal city of Ostia during a massive festival to celebrate the end of the recent Great War between some countries whose names are hard to pronounce. In all the commotion, Negi is unexpectedly approached by Fate, who tells him he's not there to fight, but to bargain. They sit down together and trade some barbs over the merit of milk tea versus coffee. Their polite jabs and attempts to paint the other one as childish can give kind of an air of two children standing next to each other measuring heights back to back, while trying to hide the fact that they're standing on their toes. Fate tells Negi he will give him and his friends safe passage back to the remaining warp gate, and they can return to the mundane world. In return, he asks only for two things. First, he asks that Negi turn over Asuna to his group. The reason for this has pretty much been revealed by this point, and it's kind of a spoiler, but suffice to say that Asuna's not what she seems to be, and bears more importance to the world and story than one might initially think, but I'm not going to get into that because that's spoilers, and I don't want to have to do another spoiler warning. Negi, of course, reacts to this very angrily, so Fate falls back onto his plan B, which is to ask Negi to ignore his organization and not interfere with any actions that they take. They even get to keep Asuna, but Fate also reveals that if his goals are achieved, it will mean the destruction of the entire magical world. Negi labors over this for a good long while. He wants to protect those around him, and his drive to protect a world he barely knows and is only now seeing for the first time is contending with a free pass to protect the friends he has grown to care deeply about and who he has responsibility for as a teacher to do everything to protect. Negi gives in. Negi even begins to agree before Asuna is the one to step in and stop this charade. It's a good thing too, because Fate was actually using a powerful magical item that would have bound Negi to his word and kept him from breaching the agreement. This one encounter tells us a lot about Fate. Fate is ruthless, but he is not cruel. He is efficient. This can also lead to him finding less aggressive solutions. Negi has continued to become stronger and stronger, and while he does not pose an actual threat to Fate himself yet, at this point, his involvement is becoming a bigger hindrance and jeopardizing the plans of Fate's organization. This encounter also tells us about Negi. He's not your typical shonen protagonist. He's not the kind of character to say, like hell I'd agree to something like that, or I don't really get it, but I can't just let you keep hurting people, or you're not living your life correctly. Negi considers negotiating with a terrorist. He actually accepts a terrorist's proposal, or at least tries to. We'll get into how Negi further sets himself apart from the standard stock later, but I felt that this was worth noting. Rather than take a direct approach of killing Negi himself, something that he could maybe manage in a one-on-one fight, but might prove more difficult when combating the full force of Negi's allies, and would lead to potential collateral damage and unnecessary casualties, Fate instead takes a more tactically sound path. He even has a backup proposal for when the first one fails. And on top of that, this encounter ends up partially being a cover for a Plan C that accounts for Negi's potential refusal. That Plan C actually gives us another insight into Fate because it involves his companions, a group of young girls who, despite their age, bear an incredible power. Their fierce loyalty to Fate comes not from fear or any kind of leverage, or that they themselves are some kind of evil, except for Tsukuyomi, who's a whole other level of batshit crazy, but not really part of this group, but out of a genuine admiration for him, and a belief that he's doing the right thing. How they met Fate and why they follow him is one of the first steps on the path to really understanding his true motives and deeper layers. The girls themselves end up being really fun, and a lot of their interactions with the heroes fall more into the realm of comedy rather than action. This is something that Akamatsu does well in Negima, introducing fun, likable side characters and fairly quickly giving them clear character relationships and personalities. This even works for one-off antagonists introduced. One of the jokes Akamatsu likes to use is to have an enemy character act somewhat mundanely or even relatable. Bonus points if there's some kind of horrific skeletal monstrosity. This kind of joke might not be particularly clever, but it is one that I always love seeing.
Now you're trying to make me out to be the bad guy.
Yes, I'm trying to make you a bad guy. We're both bad guys. We're professional bad guys. Ding. Hello.
Yes, please, belittle me in front of my henchmen.
One of my favorite examples of this kind of joke is during the Magical World arc, when we look in on Nodoka and her treasure hunting friends when they're attacked by some bounty hunters. Nodoka has just acquired an item that tells her the name of people, which synergizes perfectly with her mind-reading artifact. She looks into the thoughts of her frightened enemies, upon which she learns that one of them is embarrassed by his real name. One's a lot nicer than he seems, one has a sick mother, and the other is Akamatsu's self-insert. Finally, moving on, we have Negi, the main character of our series. Negi is easily the character who changes the most out of the cast, which is to be expected considering he's the main character. The Negi we see in the Zebek anime is a wholly different person than he is even as soon as the festival arc. The Negi of the anime is still very much a child. He tries to act as an authority figure, but he can never really handle things without hilarious hijinks becoming the result. And more often than not, he has to rely on others to get the job done. A good example of this is how the Kyoto arc plays out. While much of this is cut, Negi pretty much fails his way through, letting Konoka get kidnapped, needing Setsuna to rescue him and do a lot of the heavy lifting. Even in the end, Negi is not the one who thwarts the main villain. Instead, he is saved at the last minute by Eva. After the Kyoto arc, Negi seeks out training in both magic and hand-to-hand combat, in the form of Chinese Kenpo, and really throws himself into it. He dedicates himself so much to his training that it actually starts becoming detrimental, a fact remarked on multiple times by his worried friends. Eva allows Negi to use a magic villa she has contained within her cabin, in which a full day can be shrunk down into 1 hour. A totally original idea. Negi starts going to the villa to train literally every single day after teaching. Interestingly, this is something that would cause Negi to age at roughly twice the rate of everyone around him, and possibly explain his noticeable physical growth over a series that rightfully should last only 1 year. Although this could also be marked down as changes in Akamatsu's art style. Negi's self-sacrificing nature is a core part of who he is, and his willingness to martyr himself for others is both his greatest strength and his greatest weakness. Unlike other shonen protagonists, Negi doesn't put himself in harm's way with any air of expectation that everything will turn out alright. Negi is always worrying about protecting others, and, at least early on, his desire to defeat an opponent is more likely to be because there is no alternative that will keep people safe. Negi is prone to self-loathing, and can have sort of a defeatist attitude. He has a very low opinion of himself and his abilities, and he is not really one to accept praise from others. Part of this comes from the fact that he's constantly standing in the shadow of his father. Nagi Springfield is more than just a powerful mage. He is the savior of the entire magical world. He is a legend. He ended a world war, saved princesses, and defeated some of the strongest fighters alive, turning them into his allies in the process. After Negi takes his foray into Mundus Magicus, he learns that his father has a fan club, trading cards, biopics about him, women profess their love for him and mourn his death. Nagi was friends with world leaders, and his name still carries sway with them a decade after his disappearance. Negi is constantly measuring his own achievements through the lens of his father. He eventually meets and becomes friends with some of Nagi's old teammates from Ala Rubra, or the Red Wings. This includes Jack Racon, the manliest man to ever man, and probably the best character in the series.
全身から何か出るそれだよエターナルネギフィーバー
How can Negi ever feel like he's progressing or achieving anything when he's constantly faced with others like Racon, who can literally summon swords the size of skyscrapers ad infinitum with his artifact, or survive basically anything thrown at him? Incongruent with his self-esteem, Negi is a genius who becomes incredibly powerful. He is resourceful, his ability to plan, adapt, and invent new spells amazes even the most skilled mages. But this can serve to hurt him if he faces an opponent that understands his thinking and takes advantage of it. A common theme of Negi's character is his tendency to overcomplicate things, and make things much harder than they need to be, all while being surrounded by more simple thinking characters who have to constantly ground him. The darker elements of Negi's character start to grow more pronounced as things progress. After being tossed into the magical world, separated from his students who he's responsible for, most of which would not be expected to be capable of surviving on their own, and quickly being shown just how weak he is in the face of an overpowering enemy like Fate, Negi's drive to get stronger starts to become all-consuming. Negi has already started to move away from his earlier black and white understanding of morality and into the shades of gray that color the more adult world. His experiences in the festival arc have taught him that sometimes doing the right thing now can be the wrong thing in the long run, and hurting a few innocents now can save millions down the line. Negi has not led a happy life to this point. His mother is dead to the best of his knowledge, and his father is missing. The only time he's met his father, and indeed the only reason he has to believe his father is even alive, is that he appeared and saved Negi when his village was attacked. This attack still ended in the petrification of many of the villagers, including Negi's surrogate father figure, the fabulously named Stan. Negi has all the duties of a teacher, he has only one friend his own age, the rest of his friends are girls 5 years his senior who he has to retain some amount of respectable relationship with, and he has to be responsible for their safety. This makes it difficult for him to open up to anyone about the problems he's having, and this ends up sublimating itself into him overworking, or making some other poor decisions. Negi asks one of the most evil witches in history, who has killed untold numbers across countless centuries, whose name is feared across the magical world, to become his teacher, his master. But it's fine, she's chill now. When he's essentially offered a shortcut to greater power, one that could possibly kill him, and even if it doesn't, may lead to him becoming corrupted by dark magic to the point of turning him into a mindless beast of fearsome destructive power, he takes it. That's a lot of rough shit for a 10-year-old. Some of these decisions, if handled by a different writer or in a different way, could see Negi becoming evil. But despite all this darkness, Negi keeps from becoming a total edgelord. Negi has a lot of negative and depressive characteristics, but he's not a cynic. And his sometimes fatalist way of thinking is almost exclusively directed towards himself rather than others. The thing that keeps Negi from ever treading across that line, whether it be into becoming a villain or Shadow the Hedgehog, is other people. Not just the guidance and friendship of others, but a conviction, an ironclad resolve to protect others. I said before that Negi's tendency to put others in front of himself was a great weakness, but it's also his most admirable quality. Negi screws up a lot, but in his success and in his failures, he is always acting for others and not himself. Negi sees the best in people, and is at the same time both unwilling to open up about himself, but willing to trust someone implicitly if he thinks they're a good person. He puts his faith in the ability of others, and he is not hesitant to express his admiration for those around him. A running joke is that Negi is a bit of a lady killer, the kind of guy to watch out for in 5 to 10 years' time. His penchant for embarrassingly straightforward compliments might come off as manipulative flattery if he wasn't so obviously genuine about it. In opposition to all of his negative feelings, his doubts, and his fears, Negi does still hold on to optimism when it comes to the kindness of strangers and the ability of his friends to do anything. While I've talked a lot about things I love in Negima, it's time to address something that I don't. It's time, dear viewers, to talk about the ending. Now, I'll do my best to keep this spoiler-free, and considering how sparse this ending is, there really shouldn't be any problem with that. The ending of Negima is well regarded as one of the most disappointing in manga history, at least if you're a fan of the series. The Magical World arc wraps up, but the final boss gets away. There are still some loose ends to be taken care of, and what follows is roughly 20 chapters of wrap-up. Some of this is pretty fun. We get a chance for some characters to have final standout moments. A return to the school and daily life lets us see how much the characters have grown and changed. It's not bad. The last few chapters attempt to close out one of the major conflicts of the series, and I would say do a pretty passable job, with some level of emotional impact. What kills it for me is the final 2 chapters. The last 2 chapters of Negima take the form of a flash forward with a short side story, a few pages of reunion between the characters, and then half a chapter of an Animal House-like Where Are They Now for each character. To top it all off, Nagi is back, and the most we ever get as an explanation for that is a quick, "Oh wow, it sure is crazy how you went and fought the bad guy and saved it, huh? Yeah, it sure was, Dad. I would really feel like a jackass if I didn't get to see that. It was so exciting." Not only that, but many of the Where Are They Nows include clear hints at story elements that would have taken place had the series not been canceled. It's just such a letdown to read a series for 9 years and be given a finale on par with Poochie died on the way back to his home planet. While some of the sting has been taken out by the sequel series UQ Holder addressing and wrapping up a lot of the dropped plot threads and answering some of the bigger questions left by this ending, it still feels really disappointing, and at the time, when we didn't know that there would be anything else coming to explain anything, it was really frustrating. So why did Negima's ending suck? Well, the main reason would be that it was rushed, thanks to legal issues with Akamatsu. Many of the final chapters were released on an irregular schedule, with each one stating that they were being delayed so the author could do research. That may be somewhat true, with the sci-fi elements present in the ending, but it seems more likely that things were being dragged out because of a dispute Akamatsu had with his publisher. Seeing that he might soon be faced with a loss of creative control of his series, he decided to quickly end it and used a movie, referenced earlier, to give an alternative, more proper, albeit contrived, ending to Negima. What Akamatsu was concerned about was a law that was apparently being proposed that would give special rights to publishers and anyone who, quote, had a hand in the creation of a creative work. This neighboring copyright would give the individuals the ability to make digital versions of the work and ebooks, combat piracy, and stop secondary or derivative works, all without the written approval of the original copyright holder. Akamatsu discussed this in a blog post, which I read through with some admittedly rough translation. Akamatsu says he talked with the publisher, but despite saying that they would support the creativity of manga authors, he was not convinced. Akamatsu cites possible issues with older series being blocked from republishing when the old publisher, now a copyright holder, blocks the new publishers, citing a concern that his own publishers, Kodansha, would not honor their word about never doing such a thing. Akamatsu, having worked as a doujin artist himself, had stated that he was fine with other creators making doujins of his work, something that his publishers could go after if they had neighboring copyrights. He also mentioned that due to how copyright law worked at the time, there would still be no way to go after overseas pirating. He expressed concerns that the Agency of Cultural Affairs had ulterior motives, and that the publishing companies had influenced Diet members while going over the writers' heads, as well as concerns about the new system making contract negotiations less straightforward and letting companies more easily take advantage of creators, or not grant them sufficient copyright to their own works. He wraps up his post with the following, although this might not be a 100% perfect translation, I did my best. He says, "In the policy of, I would like to have a nuclear power plant, the desire of, I hope to have nuclear weapons in the future if possible, is hidden. As such, in the policy of, I wish to have neighboring copyright, I wonder if the desire, publishers want to have some percentage of the copyright itself in the future, if possible, is hidden. In fact, there are many manga that have been originally written by editors. If I were the president of a publishing company, I think I would think so. Then, acquisition of neighboring copyrights is the first step." This is a pretty relatable stance, as the struggle between publishers and corporations and creators regarding copyright, fan creations, creator freedom, corporate meddling is a long and rocky one. At least from what I can find, such a law never went through, although some level of neighboring copyrights exists in Japan and most other countries in some form or another. I didn't feel like combing through pages and pages of Japanese websites to find out, and at any rate, Akamatsu returned to create UQ Holder, so clearly whatever issues there were had either been resolved or he had found a way to work within or around them. Speaking of UQ Holder, I'm not going to talk about it here, but I will say that it's come a long way from where it started. Initially, it was a separate series with links to Negima and set in the same world, but as time has gone on, it's morphed into a full-blown sequel, and has devoted quite a bit of time to answering questions left by Negima and trying to round things out. It's still ongoing, and it has an anime that really deserves its own episode of RTFM, but I think if you read Negima and you enjoy it, you really have no reason not to go on to read UQ Holder as well. The ending might be my most major complaint, but Negima is far from perfect. One big aspect of the series that might turn people away is the excessive fan service. There is a lot of fan service in the early parts of Negima, and while it becomes less of a focus as the series goes on, it certainly never goes away. A running gag early in the series is Negi's magic-laden sneezes flipping girls' skirts, and by the end of the manga he's become so powerful that he can just straight up blow people's clothes off altogether. There are a lot of characters being stripped and hot spring scenes, as would be expected from the author of Love Hina. But Negima is not an ecchi series by today's standards, so don't expect anything on the level of Monster Musume or anything like that. Whether that's something that turns you away from the series is really up to you. To be honest, the reason Negima grabbed my attention back in the day was that it was one of the manga at my local Borders books that was wrapped in plastic so you couldn't read it in the store. My 12-year-old curiosity was piqued, and I read the first 190 or so chapters in just a few days online. Rest in peace, One Manga. The series also suffers from a lot of tonal inconsistencies. A lot of ridiculously over-the-top, badass things happen in Negima. And this can be played straight or for laughs, to pretty decent effect. But the drama of things is often undercut by jokes or self-aware meta-humor. This is not really a major gripe, but the locked-in framework of being a comedy series occasionally keeps Negima from growing in new directions and makes more intense scenes seem sometimes out of place. There are also a lot of convoluted and unfinished plot threads in the series. This is something that comes up in a lot of long-running manga, with whole characters being forgotten or retconned, but it still needs to be noted. The circumstances surrounding the attack on Negi's village and who carried it out changes a few times throughout the series, and the details only sort of were wrestled into making sense thanks to new information provided in UQ Holder. And my last problem with the series would probably have to be how underutilized certain elements of the cast are. I know it's difficult to dedicate sufficient screen time to such a large cast of characters, especially when there are so many so early on, but there are characters in this manga that barely get any development over the whole series, only to have major elements of their character shoved out the door and into the open with little to no explanation towards the climax, thanks to the rushed ending. Akamatsu clearly wrote himself into a corner by excluding so many students from what would end up becoming the most primary arc of the series. And despite his efforts to find excuses to bring more and more characters over to the magical world, it still never fully works out. I still don't know who the fuck Phileas Zect is, and it's looking like UQ Holder is not going to address it, and that bothers me because I have so many questions. But these complaints would never prevent me from recommending Negima to someone. It might take a little while to get started, but someone that takes the time to give Negima a chance will find an inventive story full of some truly creative action, with a solid balance between fights won through ingenuity and cunning, and fights won by being the manliest man in the room and throwing lightning swords the size of small moons at your opponent. The overindulgent Mahora Academy, with its legendary magic trees, labyrinthine libraries, and boisterous student base, is second only to the fascinating fantasy landscapes of Mundus Magicus, with its dragons, flying cities, mercenary coliseums, and other things in terms of wondrous places to experience. And the over-the-top spirit of the world is reflected in the incredibly likable characters that inhabit it. So many of my favorite characters across all anime come from Negima, and it's really a shame that I can't go into each one here. I'm sure there will be fans of Negima watching this upset that I didn't go into Evangeline, or Asuna, or Chachamaru, or the entirety of Alarubra. And I think that's a testament to just how much there is to like about Negima's cast. If I had to pick my favorite aspect of Negima, this would be it. The relationships between the heroes, the way that each grows and develops, is what keeps me coming back to this series. And I think if you give it a chance, you'll keep coming back too. And that, my friends, when it comes to Negima, is why you should read the fucking manga. Holy shit, it's finally done. I've been working on this video for more than a year, just between rewatching the animes and rereading the manga and writing and planning and editing. Yeah, it's been at least a year since I started working on this, so I am super happy that it's finished. I know the episode kind of got away from me and ended up being super long, and I've learned a lot in the making of this. I think that there's a lot of things I'm gonna probably do differently next time around, a lot of improvements that I can make, but if you have any suggestions for things you liked, things you didn't like, if you want to tell me my taste is shit, if you're somebody that likes Ava, i.e. someone that's wrong, feel free to leave a comment and let me know what you thought. If you did manage to make it to the end of the video, thank you so much for watching. I'm going to make more of these in the future. I promise that they'll be a little more streamlined. The problem with Negima is that it has such a incredibly bizarre and difficult adaptation history that I felt like that really deserved to be talked about. And when I go into other series, unless there's something like Fullmetal Alchemist where there's two completely separate adaptations, I think I can keep most of it to one episode and really just focus on the difference of what goes unadapted in the series. I do have some other videos up about the anime community in general, and they're a lot shorter and a lot easier to digest. So if that sounds like something that interests you, feel free to give them a watch. Again, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.